Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you with us today. The Denver Foundation's been around for almost a century now. We're getting ready to celebrate our 100th anniversary. And one of the things that has been really important to the foundation throughout all of its history has been really serving as a bridge between local community leaders and local community members talking about issues that are most critical. And that's how we developed this Leading and Learning series that has been running for several years. It's a special benefit for our donors and fund holders here at the Denver Foundation. And we're so happy that you could join us today. We're going to be talking about a topic that's very near and dear to our hearts, higher education. The Denver Foundation participates in the higher education sphere mostly through our scholarships program. Anybody guess how many scholarships the Denver Foundation has? Oh my God, you're our next CEO. You're so aspirational. 80, we thought that was great. So 80 scholarships, $5 million, 1,200 students each year. And we're continuing to grow and expand. We have opportunities for individuals, for families, for businesses to set up custom scholarships for populations that are most important to them. And something that we want to call your attention to today that we're really excited about and proud of is the new Denver Foundation Community Scholarship. It's a broad-based scholarship that'll give out $100,000 this year to first-generation students of color in the Colorado system. It's our first ever discretionary scholarship fund, and what that means is that anyone who's interested in contributing to a scholarship can contribute to this fund in partnership with a whole set of other donors. So we're excited to roll that out. The deadline for that is March 1st if you know of any students who are looking. And if you have an interest in talking more about that, we'd be happy to chat with you afterwards. So let's get into our panel. We're going to talk today with three pretty amazing leaders. The first is Joe Garcia, the Chancellor of the Colorado Community College System and also a new trustee of the Denver Foundation. So welcome, Joe. Tobias Guzmán, the Vice President of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Northern Colorado, and Nahum Kisner, the Executive Director of Student Support and Retention at Metropolitan State University of Denver. So right here at home. So for those of you who have been to Leading and Learning events before, the format will be familiar to you, though we've been online for the last couple of years. It's our first one in person in just a little bit. So we'll ask some broad-based questions. We'll have an opportunity to touch on a variety of topics related to higher education. And then we'll pause and have an opportunity for you all to ask questions for about the last 15 minutes of our time together. So be thinking about what those questions are as we get into the conversation. So Joe, I'm going to send it over to you first. And I wonder if you could just start us off by giving us an overview of what higher education, particularly in Colorado, looks like today from kind of a 10,000-foot view.
Thanks. I'll try to do this quickly, but it's not that simple. We have a lot of institutions here. And of course, we have public state-supported institutions, those primarily with a 2-year mission and those with a 4-year and graduate degree mission. We also have a number of private nonprofit institutions, Denver University, Colorado College, Regis. And then we have, more than anything, a lot of for-profit, small specialized institutions, although the number of those has been shrinking in recent years. Let me ask a question. How many of you earned college degrees here in Colorado? And how many of you brought degrees from out of state? You know, the number from out of state exceeded the number of you who earned them here. That's pretty typical here in Colorado. We're the second most well-educated state in the country. But so many of those graduates brought their degrees from elsewhere. We don't do as good a job in educating the students who grew up here, certainly our students of color. While we're the second most well-educated state in the country, we also have either the first or second biggest gap between degree attainment rates for our white versus our non-white populations. That gap's even bigger if you look at our urban, suburban versus our rural populations, white or otherwise. So we need to figure out how to reach more folks. Now, I will say very briefly, we have a series of different systems. The community college system consists of 13 colleges from places like Lamar to places like Denver, so right here on this campus. We have one governing board for those 13 colleges. CU has a governing board. It also has several campuses. Same with Colorado State, UNC. All of those are public institutions that receive public funding, but most of their funding comes from someplace other than the state. Frankly, we've all become more reliant on tuition. We're not under one governing board. We used to say in the old days when I first got involved that we are a loose confederation of institutions united by a common envy. So we just look at what everybody else has and think, why don't we have that? I walked into this building and I thought, dang, why does MSU have a building like this? We don't have anything like that. So that's how we work. Now, the community college system is the largest because of the number of institutions, and we serve over 100,000 students every year. We serve about half of all the students of color who attend higher education every year. But we've also, again, then we've got our state colleges. MSU used to be considered one of those state colleges. Almost all of our state colleges now have a different name. They're universities. Only Fort Lewis still calls itself a college. Who knows the difference between a college and a university? What is it? Nope, there's no difference. There's no scientific difference. You know, it is a good guess. When MSU wanted to change its name and I was lieutenant governor, I went to the governor and said they want to change their name. He said they can't. They're not a university. I said, Governor, define a university. And no matter how you define it, MSU did have some graduate programs. Actually, community colleges, we have a graduate program. We have a master's degree at one of our institutions. But if we were to call that institution a university, everybody would look at us like, what are you talking about? But we also offer four-year degrees. Does that make us a university or a state college? Well, we get hung up in things like that because we want to differentiate ourselves from everybody else, because the last thing I'll say is right now we're in the most competitive environment we've ever been in. There are just not enough students to go around, and we don't see that changing in the immediate future. A number of our institutions, other than our large R1s, have lost enrollment over the last few years. And since most of our money, as I said earlier, comes from tuition, that poses an existential crisis to many of our smaller institutions, our regional comprehensives, our state colleges, and our rural community colleges. I'll stop there. I could go on all day.
Next time we'll just bring you as a keynote, and you can. So let's stick with this this topic of enrollment for a minute. And Tobias, I wonder if I could ask you to talk about enrollment trends with students of color, and in particular, what efforts have been made to reach out to students of color and their families around post-secondary enrollment.
Good afternoon. You know, there are trends that have been probably occurring since 2015. I like to think of it as when you shake a Pepsi or soda bottle and all those little bubbles are in there, and then all those bubbles start to just move around and change. It's somewhat like that in terms of enrollment and enrollment trends. Dr. Garcia mentioned some of these remarkable things of the state of higher education. Let's think about, too, how enrollment trends are translating to matriculation rates. So, for instance, when I first started working in enrollment management in 2008, we were matriculating 46 to 50% of our students that we would accept. Today, that number is around 15%. So, UNC is not unique in seeing what those changes are, but that's what's occurring, partly because students have a lot of different choices. There are things such as the Common App, but the one thing that has really changed the enrollment game, if you will, that is how many institutions that are out of state living and sitting in here in the state of Colorado, in Denver. So for us, what we've calculated is about 40 different institutions that are recruiting our students. 40 different institutions. University of Oregon is here. Washington State is here. We have the students. We also have a high number of students of color, as Dr. Garcia mentioned. And, you know, here's an editorial opinion, and it's going to be controversial. Uh-oh.
That's good.
We should be ashamed in the state of Colorado of our funding, period. We keep talking about how we are second to last, and we should absolutely be ashamed, especially knowing that we have an incredible city, an incredible state that can produce incredible individuals working in the workforce. But we don't have the funding for higher education, and of course it goes on the backs of students. The pandemic has obviously caused incredible things to student populations and into those enrollment trends. Overall, in the nation, 1.1% decline in enrollment. HBCUs, for instance, did not see that decline. Now, you look at individual colleges and disaggregate the data, but overall, HBCUs had about a 2.2% increase. The highest was our Hispanic serving institutions. And I would also lump in the students, not necessarily institutions designated as HSIs alone, but also with high numbers of Latinx students. Those particular institutions saw about a 1.2% decrease. So what does that mean? We also know that we saw about 1 million students not sign up for college this past year. 1 million students. What does that mean? So when we're sitting here 15 years from now and we're saying, gosh, what happened back in 2020, 21, 22, 23? We're going to remember that all these things occurred, and we're going to have to retool. But we got to be thinking about that stuff right now, not in 2030, 35, 2040. Strategies is specifically for students of color. I'd like to think about this in two ways. There's these transactional strategies where you give marketing materials and you ask people to have a call to action to sign up and come visit campus and things like that. But where institutions really need to be at is making sure that they are paying attention to who their populations are, who their families are. The days of visiting with families and embracing families is not gone. In fact, it's only greater. I think about the messages that we send in our marketing materials for all campuses. And I think about some of the words and terminology that we use. You know, get your degree, what the cost is, safety. But are we translating those terms into what our students of color or students in general, what they want to hear? So for instance, when you have a first generation student, are they concerned about job security, friendly campus, cost? Absolutely. But the deliverable for them is that they can be the first in their family to get a degree, and they perhaps may change the trajectory of their family. That's powerful. But are we marketing it in that way? So, I said my controversial statement, and it's on video. Do you have something else to add to that?
I feel like you took part of my question.
Go ahead.
I feel like I don't know if this is the right time or not.
It
Yeah,
is.
Nahum,
Is it the right time?
Go with it.
Okay.
Get controversial.
Just skipping all the way through it. I see how it is. Well, I have to go off script really, really quickly. So this is a really surreal moment for me. Many, many moons ago, when I was a pup in higher ed, had the opportunity to meet these gentlemen that I'm up here with. Tobias and I were talking about it. He vaguely remembers. Joe, we met a long time ago when you were the lieutenant governor, I believe. And I say that because for me, a young man of color in higher education, they were so gracious with their time. And watching, and seeing them grow in different opportunities and leadership has been really cool for me to see. So again, this is surreal. So I'm in total geek mode right now. So as we talk about funding, one of the things that I look at, and Joe, you mentioned it as well, as we think about the different levers that universities have to pull, or money trees that they have to shake if there's a gap in funding, there's only so many. And oftentimes, and most oftentimes, it is in fact with tuition and fees. And what we see oftentimes, that impact is directly in the wallets of our students and their families. What no one in this room wants to see happen is that it's only the students who can afford to go attend college. The state of Colorado has a Colorado master plan where they're looking at how do we achieve and decrease the attainment gap for our students of color. And so the funding piece is really, really important. And so institutions have a limited amount of institutional funds that they can spend on scholarships. And then students get into the situation where there's not as much scholarship dollars and they're having to take out student loans. That's a whole nother conversation that we're thinking about student loan debt. And so, there's oftentimes universities will apply for grant funding, but oftentimes those are time limited as well. So if you're hiring staff, you may have really great progress and great initiatives, but that funding will go away after a certain period of time. So it is incumbent upon us in this room. How do we make sure that universities are funded appropriately to make sure that, particularly for our students of color, first generation, low income students, have the financial resources to be able to attend college?
Well, let me add something to that again to build on your controversial statement. It builds on something I had said. I had said what? We're the second most well-educated state in the country when you look at the percentage of our adults with a college degree. Then Tobias said, we're the second most poorly funded. We got to do something about that. Well, if you're over in the General Assembly or in the governor's place, you're saying, why? It seems like it's working out for us. Let those other states invest and then send their well-educated folks here. That was what a previous Republican governor once said to me. I don't mean to bring up party. I shouldn't have done that. But I guess you got to understand the logic there. Except, again, what I said is we're not doing a good job with our own, people who grew up here. And we're certainly not reaching those students who we need to reach now and who represent a greater share of the college-going population than they did when I was in college, which is first-generation low-income and students of color. And why do they matter? Well, when I started college, only about 25% of the jobs that were available required a college degree. In Colorado, we know that's over 70% now. We can't meet our workforce needs if we're only focusing on suburban white high school graduates. It's just not possible. We have to reach those other students if we want to power our economy, populate the companies that have come here. And that means schools like Metro and UNC and the community colleges need to get the funding they need to support those students who have greater needs and less access to personal resources.
Tobias, let me switch gears a little bit and kick it over to you to talk. Over the last several years, learning itself has gone through so many different forms. We've had folks learning in a remote setting, we've had folks learning in a hybrid setting, back to in-person. Can you talk about how those shifts have impacted the student population and how you've seen folks navigating those many changes?
So I think we were all caught off guard by the shift that we all had to make. But I think we did really well in terms of a short-term solution. But did we think systemically about it? And when I think about who's at the table making the decisions about what it means to go remote or what it means to change the learning paradigm, I'm not sure if we were always inclusive, or in other words, if all the people at the table were able to respond to what does that look like? How does that affect me? What kinds of learning outcomes now are we expecting of students? And so I always like to think of this as an assessment of equity. And when we think of it in those terms, we do get to answer some of those questions of when we're sitting at district roundtables or higher ed roundtables, are the people, the students, the families also able to react to the decisions that we make? But we kind of shy away from that because we think, well, that's going to be arduous. That's a long time of trying to get input. But it really might actually help us as we're moving forward. So when you think about the learning process, we had to immediately get technology ready. And we also needed to partner with school districts within our cities. We needed to make sure that families knew that they could come to schools and do certain pickups. So that learning at the K through 12 system affects the college system, because now who is coming to the college system? It's the students who were in those environments. So that's what I mean by thinking in terms of systems thinking. Faculty, at our university did an incredible switchover. I remember having conversations in January, and there was this difficulty of maybe putting some things online. We didn't have a choice in March. It just happened. Now when we get to this point of where we're at in the pandemic, we have to think about what lessons did we learn from being in the pandemic. Part of that is, again, asking the question of who's at the table in terms of when we're making decisions. And two, do we really have our technology set up so that it is contributing to the learning environment, which also equals our learning outcomes? And I'm someone who always looks at learning outcomes. What are we wanting to achieve? Like, I would think of this as what are we trying to achieve by having this kind of a session? And then did we achieve it? I'm sure we will, right?
Yes.
And so I think about those kinds of things, but I'm not sure if we're always asking those kinds of questions in terms of what are our learning outcomes and our objectives. Did I answer your question, or did I skip any part of that? Okay.
I think another thing that we've all been thinking about, so many impacts of the pandemic, but it seems to have brought issues of mental health into even starker relief. And so, Nahum, I wonder if you might talk about, just what do you see in this crisis? How is it impacting your students? And what are you doing as an institution to combat that?
Well, I think I think institutions knew that mental health, and I'll sort of package mental health under the umbrella of well-being. That includes financial, physical, mental health, lots of other different areas as well. So institutions knew that well-being was a concern on their campus well before the pandemic. And as we saw, witnessed, experienced ourselves, the pandemic only exacerbated those things. That manifested in a lot of different ways, depending on where you were, what institution. For us, we saw an increase in students requesting incomplete grades, whether it be because someone in their family got sick, or they themselves got sick, or maybe they lost their job. So that we're focusing on sort of that Maslow's hierarchy of, I've got to make sure I have some place to live, I've got to make sure that I have money to put food on the table, things of that nature. So, we saw it from an academic standpoint. And then I know that our counseling center was just overrun. Counseling centers in general are one of the lowest funded programs at institutions. And so I think there are opportunities for universities to, how do you bolster that? If you can only have so many counselors on your campus, what does telehealth look like? How are institutions partnering with telehealth? That's one of the things that our institution did. I'm sure others across the country did as well. The other thing that I saw in terms of the well-being anecdotally is a lot of our students, there was this very much sort of apathetic attitude towards college, towards their degree, towards their academics, because they were focused on so many other things that just academics weren't relevant. So they wanted to make sure that they were whole first. And so at our institution, I think probably similar across the state and the nation, MSU Denver has a care team. And so where students, let's say that our faculty or our staff are talking with a student, and they are the student discloses something that says, I can't pay for my housing, or I don't have any, food. So food insecurity, housing insecurity, that then triggers on our end a care report. And this care report goes to our care team, which is inside our student engagement wellness office and our dean's office. That professional, that coordinator, works directly with the student to find out what their needs are. So if they have to stop out, or if they have to ask for an incomplete, they're working with the professor, they're working with their academic advisor, they're working with financial aid. That's a big key for a lot of our students is, well, how is this going to impact my financial aid? So from a mental health standpoint, there's so much that's involved because students want to make sure that, hey, I've got to take care of my needs, but then how does that impact everything else in my life as well? So I think there's just a lot of opportunity for institutions. Again, you talked about lessons learned. And so institutions are like, okay, well, we know we need this. What is our community of culture around well-being? What does that look like? How are we making sure to normalize? And I think institutions did this really, really well, is how do you normalize the fact that, hey, it's okay if you need to talk to somebody. Here are the resources. It's okay to ask for help. So I think a lot of that institutions learned to create that culture of well-being, to make sure that students reached out as they needed help. And to make it not, again, to normalize it, to make it not awkward or, I think weird for all that matter. So, yeah.
On the mental health side, we all know it's a need, and yet you're right. When our students are looking at their priorities, it's housing, it's food, those are transportation, it's income. And while mental health impacts all those things, it's way down the list, and it's way down the list for us, frankly. None of our colleges have a counseling center, not one. We have about 13 colleges with 38 locations, but they're in places like Rangeley and Craig and Lamar and Sterling. Frankly, it's not just the college that doesn't have mental health services, it's the community. Nobody has mental health services. When I talked to our president at Colorado Northwestern Community College, which is in Craig and Rangeley, and so what do people do when someone has a mental health crisis? Who do they call? The county sheriff. That's about it. And that is not the safest or best way to address someone's mental health crisis, but there's really nothing else. So we've got to address the fact that we have a shortage of mental health workers throughout our state. Now, if you're in a well-resourced community and you're at CU Boulder and they have a medical center, there's options. But for most of us and for most of our students, they just aren't those options. We are very proud of the fact that in recent years, we are able to add food pantries to most of our colleges because so many of our students needed that. There wasn't a college around when I was in college that had a food pantry that I could go to and say, I need help. But the students we're serving now are different than the students we served then. The students who attend our institutions are probably different than the students who attend the institutions most of you attended or are sending your kids to. When we had to shift to online, we thought, well, we can shift to online. We can certainly help our instructors learn how to deliver their courses online. Our students just need a laptop and a high-speed internet in their home and a quiet room in their home where they can listen. Most of our students didn't have those things. At Lamar Community College, they turned their servers kind of outward and told students, if you come to the parking lot and you can download your assignments or upload your papers. But our students were sitting in a McDonald's, if there was a McDonald's nearby, or where they could get Wi-Fi. The things that we often take for granted in an urban environment simply don't exist at all in some of our rural communities where the higher education needs are the greatest.
I've been asked the question because mental health is a regular topic. I've been asked the question, why is it higher ed's responsibility to fix this problem? And I think that, I want to underscore the fact that all of our institutions have food pantries or clothing pantries. And so when one asks that, they have to realize that because there's a need. And the mental health and the mental well-being of a student determines if they're going to be successful, determines the ultimate student success, retention rates. And so it's always this dialectical tension that I think about of Why is it higher ed's a problem to fix? But guess what? We want higher retention rates. We want to make sure that the graduation rates are higher. Go state of Colorado, you do this, right? And then we're still questioning why we need counseling or increases in counseling. So maybe that's the second controversial comment. You think? I don't know.
That's controversial.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, Nahum mentioned as just one of the many impacts, the number of students who were taking incompletes and who were just struggling to kind of fulfill classwork. And I wonder if you have, all of you, have some commentary on ways that the pandemic or that this current time is impacting students' ability to graduate in 2 years or 4 years, and what accommodations your different institutions are making to help support those students.
Well, I'm gonna start by giving the community college system some kudos. I think there was a there was a Chalkbeat article. It might have been last December that talked about how the community college system doubled their graduation rates. And I think there's a lot that, and Joe, you had some really great quotes in there, so I don't want to steal your thunder, and happy for you to talk about that as well. But I thought there's a lot that we could learn 2-year and 4-year universities around how we are supporting the student need. And that seems easy, but again, we talk about that community of care, and I think that's one thing that community college system did to double those graduation rates. And even MSU Denver, as we looked at, you know, what are some of the things that were impacting graduation? First and foremost for us, we had a lot of students, if you think about just enrollment just in general, for us, if a student doesn't pay their tuition balance, naturally they can't go to college. They can't enroll the next semester. So our university leadership and support and collaboration with our advancement and foundation team, we have scholarships that are dedicated for students that are within 30 credits. So they're able to support students that are within 30 credits of graduating. So making sure if there's a financial barrier, we're taking care of that as well. The second piece that we looked at from MSU Denver is looking at those students that were 90 plus credits. So that low-hanging fruit for those students who have been taking courses and you know, they've got 90 or maybe even it's 100 credits. How do we connect with those students? Say, hey, Nam, I know you've got 100 credits. We want you to finish. What's that going to take? So we have a group of advisors that are reaching out to those students, having those conversations and saying, hey, maybe an independent degree plan might be best suited for you. It looks like if you changed your major to communications, you'd be able to graduate next semester. So being very intentional about the different pockets of students. So from a financial perspective, how are we making sure that we are supporting those students if there is a financial barrier? From an academic standpoint, for those students that have, you know, 90 plus credits, connecting with those students. But then also from, you know, from our perspective, how do we make sure that we're illuminating that pathway to graduation? And what I mean by that, again, you look at a student, whether it's a freshman or a student that has 90 plus credits, it's really important that that student knows what are the courses that they're going to take throughout their 4 to 6 years at the university. And so it is, that might change obviously, but one of the things that the student knows coming in, and even for those students that are at 90 plus credits, here is your pathway to that. So we look at from a financial perspective, we look at from an academic perspective. Something unique that MSU Denver did is we have completion grants. And so for those students that, you know, had a balance, I can't remember the exact number, one of the things that we looked at is paying off their tuition balance, but then in order to do that, the student had to meet with an academic advisor. There's lots of data out there that shows that once a student meets with their academic advisor, retention rate and graduation increases. And so these completion grants, it was a one-time fund, but during the pandemic, it was really impactful because those students had a increase in enrollment, but then also the graduation rate as well too. So those are 3 areas from MSU Denver's perspective as we looked at how do we make sure that we illuminate the pathway to graduation, remove financial barriers, and talk the student through their degree plan.
Yeah, if you can. You know, one of the things that has been, I think, most sobering to all of us up here is we've spent our careers trying to close those attainment gaps I talked about earlier that separate our white residents from our non-white residents. We had a very big gap. We made progress over the last decade in closing those gaps by getting more and more students of color, not just in, but through institutions of higher education. the pandemic upended all of that. Those are the students we lost, not just in Colorado, but nationally. Of those 1 million fewer students who Tobias referred to earlier, who didn't enroll in college, they were disproportionately low income, black and brown. So our gaps now that we worked so hard to close are now widening again. That is a real problem. And the institutions that lost enrollment were the access institutions, the community colleges, Metro. Frankly, the R1 universities, the flagships, they're growing enrollment right now while the rest of us are losing students. And the students we're losing, again, are the key to our economic future. You know, a lot of schools, we look at what's prestige. How do we define prestige at an institution? Often it's by how many students they turn away. Well, we don't take pride in how many students we turn away. We take pride in the fact that we accept every student who comes to our door and we try to help them succeed. And higher ed has to move beyond the traditional select and sort. You know, we're going to be very selective, and then we're going to weed out the undeserving, the low performers. That's how we know we're good. I say we're taking tuition, we're accepting tuition dollars from all these students. We need to figure out, instead of select and sort, how do we, again, instead support for success? How do we build in the mechanisms we need, that they need, not so that we're lowering the bar, but we're providing the tools that will allow them to get over that bar and be successful. Our graduation rates in this state, I'm proud of the fact that community colleges over the last 5 years have doubled our graduation rates. You know what? They're still dismal. Most of our students don't graduate. When you look at a school like Metro, it's done tremendous work, and yet its 6-year graduation rate is still low. Who knows the 6-year graduation rate for CU Boulder? It's about 65%. You know, that's nothing to write home about. You know, the highest graduation rates we see in the state are at private institutions. You know, they're at, frankly, the Air Force Academy or Colorado College, but where they spend a multiple of what we spend on every student. So we have to recognize that we need to invest in our students, and it is an investment, but we have just lost way too many students who we desperately need to get through so that we can build the workforce that Colorado will need for the future.
We also still use language that is very elitist. We talk about what's the right fit for our institution, and we talk about we want the best and the brightest. Guess what? That language was maybe 25 years old and probably wasn't good then. But today I still hear what's the best fit, and we need the best and brightest. Well, who is that? And so part of this is just language that we are all using, whether that is our news and media people, or if it's our administrations within our institutions. It just has to stop, because it's exclusive and isolating.
I'm going to invite you all into the conversation now. So hopefully you've been thinking of some great questions. Yeah, have at it.
Well, first, nobody calls me Dr. Garcia. You guys know that. I'm Joe. I'm a lawyer by education, not a PhD or an EDD. Don't hold that against me. But too many of our students don't. We have that, what we used to call summer melt. Students, when they're in their senior year, say, how many of you expect to go to college? Virtually all raise their hand. But so many don't, because once they graduate from high school, who takes responsibility for helping them navigate what's frankly a pretty complex system of filling out FAFSAs and figuring out where to apply and when to apply, sending in deposits? We just lose too many students who don't have someone at home helping them walk through the process. And that, again, particularly impacts those students who are low income and students of color. Those are the ones we, again, lose the most. So we need to figure out how to blur those lines, where it's not you finish high school, then you go to college, and when you show up at college, then the university holds your hand from that point. We've got to figure out that. Right now, frankly, about 40% of students who take concurrent enrollment classes in high school and earned college credit, they don't go anywhere either. And we think, well, wait a minute, we put that in place simply to help more students make that transition. So we've just got to focus some resources on helping those students. And right now the students are helped by third-party nonprofits that say we want to help those students. We want to identify them in high school. We want to help move them through to college. But it's not the universities and colleges for the most part, and it's certainly not the high schools. And that's what we need to address. And the last thing I'll say is, look, when we look at who our colleges recruit, frankly, and it's in their interests, it's like any other business. You recruit the students who are most likely to show up and pay full tuition. You know, there's perverse incentives that are built in to not look to the students we most need to educate, but to look to the students we all want to educate. And so, Tobias, you referenced this. You are getting a lower yield because CU, which used to say, no, those are UNC students, now wants your students. They want Metro students. They want our students. And we used to say, you know, these are our students. But no, there's not enough students, so we'll take them. And frankly, we don't want CU to focus so much on non-resident students, but why wouldn't they? If the state isn't funding them well enough and saying rely on tuition, well, shoot, I'd rather get a student who would pay non-resident full rate than take a resident student who I have to scholarship because my revenue is coming from tuition. And again, all those things are incentives that cause us to recruit students who don't need to be recruited, who are going to go anyway, and we're not helping those students who are on the edge and may not go. And then we shouldn't be surprised when they don't.
You know, as when you asked that question, the first thing that I thought about was a student's why. So of the students that apply and don't go anywhere, number one, I mean, you mentioned it, is who at home is helping them through the process to talk through that. Of that 40%, how many of them were their first in their college to go to the first in their family to go to college? So that process alone is daunting. And so as you think about that piece alone of just having someone navigate, and I was fortunate enough to where, you know, I saw my sister go through it, and it was a clunky process at the time. This was paper FAFSA back in the day. Got through it. So we were able to see it and navigate that. But for many of the students that are coming to our institutions, there is not that. Secondly, I also think about, you know, the why. For a lot of the students, you sort of have to go to college, you know, or have to go to high school. But you have someone at home say, hey, get you out the door, go to school, you're there, you know, and then you come home. But then college is very, very different. We know from a higher ed perspective and a community perspective of the impact from a economic mobility standpoint, what that looks like and how a college degree can help that. But for those students at home, how do we as a support system, as leaders in higher education, how are we making sure that we are, you and I talked about that engagement with families, having that in-depth conversations with families of helping them understand the importance and what it means to go to college and how it can help improve economic mobility in their lives. And so that's where I think higher education can continue to do the work around the benefits of education while connecting to industry and employment.
Let me add one quick thing. Right now, we know a lot of our students who come from low-income families are looking at the opportunity to make higher hourly wages than they ever have. And they've got families who are saying, why do you need to go to college? Right now, you'd go make 18, 20 bucks an hour and help us, and we need the help. Your kids and my kids aren't hearing that same thing. So we've got to recognize that our biggest competition really up here isn't each other. It's a hot job market. And then we also have a lot of figures, public figures who have been educated at the most elite institutions in the country saying, higher education, that's dumb, it's indoctrination, it's a waste of money, we shouldn't be sending our kids there. And so we're sending a message that higher education is too costly and it's irrelevant. And frankly, it's neither of those things if we can get students to come in and talk to us about the financial aid that's available.
All right, who's next?
The cost of higher ed, what we charge students, is a function of what the state provides us, because we have two sources of revenue: state general fund and tuition. And when we get less general fund, we need more tuition and we raise rates. All of our institutions serve students who are very price sensitive. You know, if your kid got into Stanford, Dr. Lopez, you don't care what it costs. Your kid is going to go to Stanford. And even if they raise tuition, so those institutions are always going to have students who are willing to pay the full freight. Our institutions aren't. But let's be real about student debt. We all hear anecdotes about students who graduate and owe $100,000, and they've got a history degree and they're working at Starbucks. We need to look at data, not anecdotes. And the data is pretty clear. More than half of our students who graduate with no debt at all. I think that's true at our institutions. And those who do graduate with debt owe around $20,000 to $25,000. And those students, if they complete, are frankly going to get jobs that are going to allow them to pay that off. The real problem is students who come to our institutions, or worse, the for-profit institutions, and don't get a degree at all. And they owe $9,000, $10,000, $12,000, but they have no ability to pay that back because they're no better off than when they started. That's why we've got to focus on completion and success, not just keeping costs down, and not just saying we want to eliminate debt altogether. We just want to make sure you graduate with a credential that's going to allow you to earn enough money to pay that off. That is what I think we need to be focused on.
I agree.
All right, yes.
Well, and it's worse than that, because not all student debt is government supported student debt. A lot of it's invisible debt. It's credit card debt. It's private lenders who are charging far more because you can only get, government supported student loans up to a certain amount. But even those, you're right, it's too high when you look at what market rate is for a home mortgage. You know, you're right, we do need to address that. But for years, funders, had government support and really provided way more dollars in loans because it was profitable. And for years, they made boatloads of money when students were able to graduate and pay it off. But right now, we have too many students who are taking on that debt, who took on that debt. And we've heard about, students who went to school in the 80s and 90s and are still paying off debt when they're in their 50s. It should not work that way.
I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just comment as we come to a close. What are the one or two really key things that you'd like these folks to take away with them as a part of this conversation? And whoever would like to start.
Go first. You want to go first?
Or we'll just assign it to Joe.
Well,
It's delegation.
it's delegated.
Just achieve that.
I'd say believe in the power of higher education. It does change lives. It certainly changed mine. I think it's changed lives for most of us here in this room. But right now, we've got too many people at a national level saying higher education doesn't matter. If you go back to the last recession and we look at who lost their jobs and who kept them, people with a degree kept their jobs, people without lost them. If we look at the recovery after the recession, the people who got jobs were those with a college education. There are fewer and fewer and fewer jobs every day available for folks with only a high school diploma. Higher education doesn't have to be a 4-year liberal arts degree. It can be getting a trade certificate at a trade school or a community college, but some higher education is necessary, and it isn't too expensive. We look at the sticker price. None of our students pay the sticker price at our institutions. Come talk to a financial aid officer. You'll be surprised at how much help you can get.
I think we're still stuck in some of our old paradigms, and we don't want to change them because we already feel like there's so much changing around us. And so what happens is that we get paralyzed. And what I would like to leave with you is that if you have the ability to help that paralysis, or to help opine how important it is for us to be thinking about what change looks like in higher education, that we should be doing that. And it's not, yes, it is a lot of small changes, but it's some big changes like what you're talking about in terms of the percentage on loan debt. Who's talking about that? The other piece is that there's a threat to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. And it's not just an add-on, but in fact, it's the nexus to what we do in our work. Whether you're a professor, whether you're a custodian, whether you're a dining service worker, or a residence hall staff member, it's the nexus to what we do. Everyone in this room here, whether you believe it or not, has an incredible amount of diversity. It all depends on how you define it. When you ask someone how do you define it, people automatically go to race and ethnicity. It is very important, yes, but first generation status, where did you grow up? What's your background? All those things are critical. And guess what? When the states that are having this threat and accounting for every dollar every time you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, is not good. I mean, that's really simple to say. It's just not good. But we need to continue to talk about it because that is the future of our students. Is that they are coming educated from high school talking about their pronouns, whether you agree with it or not. They are talking about their pronouns. They're talking about the differences and the inclusion that makes them feel included when they enter a room. We have to pay attention to those things.
I should have gone first. It's fine.
Bring it on.
Yeah. You know, I think for me, it's a call to action. So you've heard us talk about the things that we see at our institutions and nationally. And all of you in this room, all of us in this room have a sphere of influence. And so I encourage you all to look at who your sphere of influence is to help shape how folks think about higher education, how folks think about funding for education, how folks think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and the resources that are needed to ensure that the most impacted or the students not at the table are able to attend college, retain, and graduate. And so I encourage you all to look at your sphere of influence, your networks, whether it's legislatures, whether it's funders, donors, other higher education or community leaders, helping us shape the conversation around higher education and the impact for our students.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, have it.
I think we all try. There's a lot of counselors out there. I think a lot of them, frankly, don't have very good information. What they know is what they knew when they went to college, sometimes 30 years ago, and they select and sort too. They tell the student, you may have big ambitions, you don't have a lot of money, go to a community college, when they might be better served going to CU or UNC. And I really think we ought to help students get into the very best institution they can, and then help them find financial resources to go. And I just think our counselors don't always know. They look at an old model and say, because you have this GPA and this ACT score, you go here, you go there. And they don't ask the student, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? And I think we need to be more aware of that and help our counselors understand that's their role.
It's very formulaic, and part of it is what I was talking about in terms of the paradigm. That's a paradigm that completely needs to shift. And part of it is who is looking at the training that we offer these counselors. And are we saying, let's shift this training so that what you're talking about, the narrative that you're using, is inclusive, is asset-based as opposed to deficit-minded. You know, if we shift the conversation, if we shift the training, we'll have different outcomes. But guess what? We're expecting different outcomes by doing the same training and the same instruction.
as a former high school counselor, I think one thing that is important, yes, the updated training and communication and collaboration. Lots of institutions, community college system as well, and UNC offer trainings for sort of counselor breakfasts. And at those opportunities, that's where institutions can talk about, here's what's new in financial aid, or here's how to read a financial aid package. I know one thing that institutions are really working towards is getting out those financial aid packages early, so that then the families can have an opportunity to go through it. Now, there's a lot of, I'm making a lot of assumptions in that comment because the families may not necessarily know how to read that. It's very cumbersome, right? And so back to the training is, how do we make sure that from an institutional perspective, when we send out a financial aid package, we're not using administrative language, but we're using student-friendly, student-centered language. So here's what this means. Here's how much you would owe. Things of that nature. So lots of opportunity on the institutional side as well, and the training and how the language that we use to help our families make the best decision for themselves.
We'll be sending out a ways to engage. If you've been to one of these before, you know what those look like. It's things to read, things to watch, things to think about, things to give to that relate to the topics that we talked about here today. Don't forget to ask any of our staff members about the Denver Foundation Community Scholarship. We're really excited about it and would love to share more about that with you. And thank you so much for being here.